the pandemic's had a dramatic impact on inequality around the world. I think it's supercharged existing inequalities. Inequality is rising in all countries. A lot of the impacts that we've seen have been similar, proportionally. It's people who were already on the front lines of inequality who've been hit the hardest. People of color, women, people from working class communities. We've seen, universally that the elites, the richest in the US context, the dollar billionaires have been, as you've handily catchphrased it at IPS, they've been pandemic profiteering. That continued elite capture of the wealth and the power has continued in every country around the world. It's in one form or another, whether it's through the kind of cronyism and the corruption with loans that are coming into different countries to respond to the pandemic, corrupt PPE contracts and tenders. So that extreme contrast between people who were already struggling on the front lines of inequality have been hit the hardest. And that's everything from, in terms of just life and death with this pandemic, who literally lives and dies, through to incomes, through to the levels of violence that people are experiencing. Women, obviously, at the front lines of that. Whether people have food to eat that day, whether they're able to access any form of education. We have some governments who've responded much better. We all keep talking about Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. The interesting thing on the government side was, particularly in the initial phases of the pandemic, where governments who are not natural allies in the fight against inequality on any kind of a deep structural level were forced into at least temporarily introducing policies that we would absolutely agree with, and movements have been fighting for decades, whether it's universal basic income grants, furloughing schemes for jobs, greater spending on public health care, and so on. We saw at least some temporary measures of things that governments, very neoliberal governments, said were impossible for decades, suddenly became possible in the early days of the response to this pandemic. Now, of course, that doesn't at all mean that they have had a complete change of approach and ideology. The fight has to be about making those things much deeper, broader, making them permanent, and so on. And on the other positive side, I think the big thing that we've seen in this pandemic was actually that the hope comes from people's organizing. So grassroots movements have really shown up. People have shown up for each other, care at that very local level. So people literally taking care of the people around them, in their families, in their communities.